So good afternoon. I am Anto Buriarjo and welcome to Monday Live. This is a show that we do every Monday afternoon to help us get through the pandemic and also to try and figure out what's on the other side for commercial buildings. Profiles of the members of Monday Live are on mondaylive.org. Just a reminder that the views expressed here are of the individual, not of any company or organization. Please post questions and comments on the Zoom Q&A and chat. And if you could complete the survey at the end. This slide deck is on mondaylive.org, actually on the homepage. So if you want any of the links that's on here, head over in that direction. So this is our agenda for today. We'll have a general chit chat as we always do. And then the main theme of today is managed service providers or managed services providers. There's too many S's there somewhere. And the opportunity for that in BAS. So that should be a nice, interesting conversation. Have a few slides just to share what the team has been thinking about. Roger Woodward tells us that Regus is having problems. And the IoT is getting into an interesting spot in the hype curve. So that'll be interesting discussion. Ken Sinclair is focused on October, tossing transformation torches. Okay, we look forward to that. Anno is talking about Cushman Wakefield, or was this last week? Maybe this was from last week, I can't remember.
Last week.
All right. I noticed a couple of posts to do with CDC changing something. It's a little bit confusing what's going on there because they post something and then it was wrong and then they're changing something. And I was trying to read this and I got even more confused. But the bottom line is the subject is all about how ventilation or how poor ventilation is not a good thing in COVID. I think we've talked about that quite a lot. Mark Peacock talking about ROI of healthy buildings is strong. It's good. I'm sure he'll say more about that. And that's it for the opening slide. So throw it over to maybe Roger, throw it to you. Talk about the Regus and the hype curve thing. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, obviously with Regus there, it's the flex office thing is obviously not going that well. If they've got Chapter 11 on nearly 100 locations across the country now, which you'd have thought that may be something that might gain some popularity with people being able to dip in and out of places, but they're obviously not looking at that. The other subject there was just something we covered the other week, which is quite an interesting article on the role of the MSI continue to grow as smart buildings, the demand really for COVID is driving more technology solutions now, and you need something like an MSI to integrate it all. And it's interesting for the other one to see Facebook throwing its hat in the ring for the infinite office space and started working with Logitech. They're kind of introducing sort of VR and all sorts of things into their gaming software. But the Gartner thing I thought was interesting just because even though it's not quite our industry, it's actually saying that the IoT for that is still 2 to 5 years away. We constantly hear about the IoT in buildings and everything else, but according to them, it's still some way off before it actually becomes fully applicable, although it's down there at the bottom of the hype curve now and is reaching that kind of more mature stage of hype and beginning to grow the curve that's putting it into reality. So kind of really at the beginning of the reality stage, I guess it's saying.
Great. Any questions on that or comments on that? The Gartner curve has always intrigued me. Just watching that. Ken, do you want to talk about your October?
Okay, yeah, what I see is just there's some, this whole transformation theme that I've been on for the last month and a bit is there's some interesting things happening, and I've used it to as a torch, we're tossing torches, and it's basically, there's a lot of interaction going between the young folks. We're trying to understand a little bit better how they operate in this remote environment, and they're now coming over and asking us, you know, what the heck is that we really do in those remote buildings, and why are we there? And so there's a lot of great questions being asked, and transformation is not just change, it's doing it completely different. And the other thing, of course, is the amazing rise of the powerful web companies such as Google and Amazon, and them starting to build their own bridges to data sensor connections and stuff. I think this is something for our industry to kind of watch and see how that all evolves. So a lot of radical change, a lot of transformation, and the burning tree concern of the fact that we have these torches potentially landing on assets that are deeply rooted and aren't easy to move. And with that thought, we may have sort of burning trees. So we basically have to think how we're going to make these areas more agile and more in tune with the unbelievable transformations that are occurring.
So Ken, I've spent a little time with a gentleman from a large Fortune 500 here in Richmond over the weekend, and the word that he brought up that is concerning to their organization is culture. So working remotely challenges how you communicate and build and maintain culture in your organization. And so I think the other problem, the obvious problem of how do you get people back in buildings, which is what we've been asking ourselves for 2 months now or more, I think is more a political question than it is a logistical one. I think we could all return to buildings tomorrow if we just made up our mind to do it. Lord knows we're going to grocery stores and big box retailers and doing it successfully. So don't tell me you can't go to an office building safely if we just made up our mind to do it. But at the cultural level, which is to your point around the youth, I don't know that the youth grasps that or thinks about it the way maybe this group would. In terms of, as a management team at the board level, do they feel that they can be successful communicating the company culture through a bunch of remote employees? Mm-hmm. How do you do that? How do you effectively manage and disseminate culture in a disparate, completely decentralized workforce?
Well, of course, there's companies that's exactly how they built, and that is their culture. Their culture is remote, so we're bumping into those cultures. Actually, an example that my daughter works for Shopify, and that's a company that has grown extremely quickly. And I mean, the guy created the company to sell snowboards, and then basically it's gone from there to 8,000 people or something like that. But now there's a whole other cultures that we're bumping into, and I think that's what's starting to make the transformation. So what we have to do is we have to decide, do we want to have that kind of a culture, or do we want to maintain our deep-rooted cultures? So I don't profess to have any knowledge of exactly how this is all going to roll out. I'm just an observer trying to document stuff as usual.
And then Steve, and Ken, I'm sitting here when you mentioned that, wondering if certain constituents inside the organization are just doing a land grab, so to speak. So for instance, maybe it's the younger people saying, yeah, we could go back, but you know what? We don't want to, so we're going to pretend we can't go back. Right. Or it's the executives saying, it's an opportunity to save on real estate. I mean, you never know what kind of internal machinations are happening with certain constituencies inside an organization and what the ramifications are going to be for those moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a sort of cycle between culture and productivity, right? Because productivity at the end of the day is what the companies care about. And as the culture changes, does that improve or diminish productivity? And if it improves it, then that culture change is likely to stick, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So Steve, in this conversation with this person, did he, she mention anything about risk and having that was part of his dilemma, that trying to maintain low or no risk at all with respect
Risk,
to
you mean health risk? What kind of risk?
risk of the employee coming back to the office and then all of a sudden a couple folks test positive or show positive signs?
No, I wasn't.
So forth and so on.
No, the frustration for this individual was that the complete uncertainty about when they're going back.
Mhm.
And so I was trying to just differentiate between my point of we can go back tomorrow if we make up our mind to go back tomorrow, because we have ways to protect people, right?
Mhm.
But and yes, there's always a certain amount of risk. There's a certain amount of risk when you go to the grocery store, but we're all going to the grocery store, right? So, but the cultural piece is about human relationships. And how do you keep those how do you develop and mature those relationships for the benefit of the organization? And that's what this individual was also concerned about. You know, some people just don't want to or don't work well in isolation. That's just a fact. And there's some people who don't want to work well because they want to get out of the house and away, you know, and have this distinction between their work and their home. They don't want those lines blurred. So, you know, I wouldn't call that a cultural thing, but it's a way of life kind of dynamic. And maybe to Ken's point, maybe that'll mean they'll want to work for certain kinds of companies who believe in having all their employees in one place or aggregating them, versus those that are willing to have them fully decentralized.
Well, I think the other thing that's evolving there, as we've talked about before, is the in-between. And there definitely is a need for that whole social in-between.
Right.
And maybe it won't be so far away. You know, they won't have to travel to the center of a large city. Maybe it'll be closer to your community and you'll actually go to some repurposed facility and you'll basically have your you know, that whole cultural work environment. So I think that's what's inside. I see inside the transformation is everything is up for transformation. The rule is there's no rules, and everything that was a constant before is now a variable, and that makes it extremely hard for us to move ahead as an industry, and anybody to move ahead as an industry.
Yeah.
So I suggest we move on to our main topic,
okay.
Which is managed services or managed service providers. Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you. Do you want me to put up the slides now, or?
Yes, please. Yep.
Okay, I'll do that. And while I do that, why don't you?
Yeah. So, as an introduction, the reason I got nominated to do this presentation today is because prior to doing what I'm doing today, which is doing a cybersecurity solutions for the OT industry as Totem Buildings, I ran an IT managed services company for 5 years. And that's all we did was managed services. So I learned a great deal around what that's all about, what that takes, what it looks like. And so I wanted to really divide this presentation into 3 parts, because generally speaking, when we talk about managed services, we tend to look at the IT industry because that's where it's been most successfully applied. And I want to go through the characteristics of that so that we have perhaps a better framework for discussion before talking about managed services in our industry and building controls. So with that, and then finally, the third topic is the value. How do we go about selling OT managed services? What's the value proposition? Next slide, please. All right. So in case you were wondering how big a business IT managed services is, it's forecasted to be about $250 billion this next year. So it's quite substantial. And in terms of understanding why it's become, and to put that in perspective now, it's going to be about double in size between 2017 and 2022. So it's growing at a very significant rate. So the answer is why? Why is that possible? What's driving it? And you need to actually go back to the 1970s and 80s when companies started using IT technology to begin with. You bought the computers, you hired the people. So most businesses going back to that era believed they had to take two steps. They had to buy the technology and they had to hire the people. So it was very common, even down to small businesses, that you insourced your IT talent. You always had an IT department that you could go to to install, maintain, and keep all this stuff running. And of course, it grew into a variety of different skill sets, some that were associated with the infrastructure, others that were associated with the applications themselves, and maybe even a third that had to do with supporting the employees. But essentially, your IT workforce were people that worked for the company. So what became more obvious in the last 20 years is that there was an opportunity for that talent, which is arguably fairly expensive talent, to be outsourced. And you've had a couple different ways in which it's being done. One is it's being outsourced it's being offshored just to reduce the raw cost of the labor, to whether it's Eastern Europe or India or China. And then you have the other reason, which is economies of scale. So if you're a small business and let's say you can afford one person, well, that one person or two people, they have to be a jack of all trades. They got to know something about networking, something about applications, something about helping end users, something about installing software and updating operating systems. It's asking an awful lot. And so what you typically end up with is the person may be strong in one area and weak in the other 4 or 5. But that's all you can afford. When you go to a outsourced managed service provider in the IT business, of which there are many, you benefit from economies of scale. How? Because you're not getting just one person, you're getting a team, and that team has broad skill sets that go from what's typically called multiple tiers of skills, tier 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 4, different tiers of skills across a wide variety of IT-related capabilities. They'll have dedicated folks for networking, dedicated folks for servers, dedicated folks for help desk, and so on. And number one. Number two, that employee which wants to work regular business hours, these managed service providers can work 24/7. So you have the ability of getting an answer and support any time of day or night, and that support can vary in terms of skill sets. So if the first person can't answer the question, it's over their head, it can be elevated to the next person up the ladder. So there's a clear benefits of scale. And what also, of course, drives this is that because the insourced talent can be fairly expensive, you can actually save money outsourcing certain aspects of that support. So it's not about spending necessarily more money. You can actually spend less money and get better service for that dollar. So those are the reasons, the fundamental reasons why outsourced or managed services has been growing the way it has been within the IT world. Now, at the same time that's been going on, you got the emergence of cloud going back now about 20 years. And so historically, the computers were all premise-based. And then what then happened is that there were colos. So you took your computers, you paid for a local data center to take care, so you didn't have to have a computer room any longer. But basically it was your computer and in somebody else's data center. And then cloud computing comes along and says, hey, we can do this truly at scale. and you can just buy just the compute power you need. You no longer have to oversize your computers. We now do the data center function. We scale your demand as you need it, up and down. And that's one of the key things, is up and down. So if you don't need it at night, you can scale down your compute that you're paying money for. So in this particular case, where the hardware is concerned for cloud computing, it's highly scalable, and it can be sold on a subscription basis that's tied to monthly pricing, which is even more preferable versus what we're used to, which are long-term contracts, if any. So software has, in the process, because of cloud, is migrated from shrink wrap, where you buy the software and you buy some sort of service agreement with it, where you might be paying 20% per year on top of whatever you paid for the software. Today, in today's market, and I checked in with some people that I'm familiar with just to confirm my understanding, all the major software products, and I'm talking about the ERP systems, that caliber, that class, everything has moved to the cloud now. It's very difficult to buy traditional software under the tradition, under that kind of a premise-based model. So the world has absolutely moved, but in this case, because hardware cloud computing is centralized, the provider gets all the benefits of economies of scale. And as I'll mention in a second, when we move to our world, we're the opposite. We're fully distributed for the most part. All our devices are in a building. We can't, we can't use obviously one controller in a building and use it to control somebody else's mechanical systems. So maybe at a server level, there might be the possibility of that, but certainly not at the device level. So, and then lastly, monthly subscriptions are designed to float with your business demands. So whether it's tied to a user or a device, as your volume goes up and down, your price goes up and down, becomes very predictable and manageable in that sense. You don't have to over-purchase your capacity. You don't have to over-purchase your users, your support staff. Everything just varies nicely with the volume of your business as it goes on. So these are sort of the underlying characteristics and reasons why IT managed services has been as successful as it's been and continues to be. Next slide, please. All right, so we go into our world, and it's clearly different. So when we're a world where, as I've mentioned, the devices are fully distributed, they're dedicated to the device, to the building itself and the systems that we control, and the lifetime is designed in theory to last a long time. You put the controls in, you should get 10 plus years out of it. They're wired to run these equipment around the clock. And the reason it lends itself to CapEx is because there's all that upfront cost, because the hardware, which is typically a third of the total cost, then you've got your labor, which is divided between your engineering and your installation. And so it's not just, all that has to be taken into account. So when you try to move from CapEx to OpEx, you need to now amortize all of that hardware and all of that labor. And you're not going to do that on a per month basis. You're going to have to move to contracts that are multi-year. And so those yearly terms are typically 3 to 5 years in order for you to get your monthly rate down to something that the customer might consider an advantage. So knowing all that, what are the service opportunities that I think are available to us? So I've listed here the ones that I think that come to mind for me, which is, moving away from sort of the break fix mentality to something that rolls up under a service agreement. Certainly your hardware maintenance can be done in that fashion. Obviously, when we, as consumers, we have the opportunity when we buy an appliance to get a warranty service agreement on it. We could do the same thing for our stuff. But the data analytics, which a number of you guys are involved with, of course, lends itself to this. Performance reporting, software upgrades, managing the network, managing the servers, doing system administration on the whole system. All of these things are labor intensive, and with the exception of the hardware. And I point them out because this is the closest analogy to the IT world, where I said that what drives things here is labor. And so that's what, at least conceptually, we're trying to maximize is the labor content of the service. Next slide. So what are we really selling? Well, how can we convince customers to move in this direction? Well, purely going OpEx versus CapEx, for certain owners, the advantages of cash flow are going to be attractive. So if they like the idea of having a monthly payment versus fronting all the money in a traditional way, that might be of benefit to them. And then from a tax standpoint, anything that's OpEx gets taken off, as a business expense in the year in which it's incurred. Whereas with CapEx, you have to depreciate it, you have to run all your calculations and justify them and so on. So it can be, ultimately you get the tax benefit, but here it's just how it's done with OpEx. It goes off in the year in which it's expensed. So it's very, very clear, very understandable to everyone. I think the big challenge that we've had as an industry is point number 2, is convincing our customers that the quality of service post-construction is worth the expense. In the areas of keeping the software up to date, not having sort of a guarantee that if I got a problem with the hardware, no questions asked, just come in and take care of it. I don't have to issue anything special other than just to notify you that I got a problem. Performance optimization, that's behind data analytics as an example. But in optimizing performance leads to the last bullet around reduced operating expenses. But I want to throw in cybersecurity, because certainly that's the piece that Totem Buildings is concerned about. But bigger picture wise, it's life cycle management. So it's easy to lose sight of what happens over time. And there's a value proposition to the owner to have someone who's looking out for their benefit on the life cycle. When things need to be upgraded and replaced, and maximize that period of time that I can get useful life out of that system, which finally leads to reduced operating expenses. What are opportunities there? And again, most of you know about the first two, which is reducing energy consumption and getting and having as few low maintenance costs on the mechanical systems as possible. And there may be, in certain cases, the opportunity to reduce facility engineering labor. So along the lines of what I talked about on the IT side, if I can provide as a managed service some of the things that are talked about in the second bullet, then potentially that organization can do their job with fewer internal staff. So that's the concept there. It's not clear that how much of that's going to be available, because in general, facility engineering teams are pretty thin. So there's not necessarily a lot of labor to offset. But yeah, this is where I see where we are right now. And the challenge is turning services, building the demand for the services that I talk about here in bullet number 2. Comments, reaction?
The question that immediately comes to my mind is there not an overlap between what you're describing and the role of the MSI?
So when you think about the MSI, Anto, do you think of that company primarily in making sure that the system goes in well up front versus how much responsibility do they carry post-construction?
And I don't know.
Yeah.
I often get
Yeah.
confused with MSI, but some of the things like software upgrade and things are in the same area. So
Yeah, I mean, if I would advocate that that's what an MSI should be presenting themselves as being able to do for the building owner is think of that post-construction, that life cycle. We will help manage and optimize and help get the greatest performance out of your building, because we know everything that went in. We were involved with all the different contractors. We understand how all the data has been integrated, and we have the ability, as many do, to analyze that data as well. So they're perfectly positioned to tell this story. The question is, are they and will they? Again, for me, it's what I did for 5 years. That's the only story I told. But I think getting the MSIs to the point where they're comfortable telling this story is another challenge, because there's not a lot of history there. Anybody agree or disagree with what I just said on that point about the MSIs?
I agree, Steve. I think a true MSI and where we are going as an industry, the role of managed services will need to be presented as an option by them to building owners and operators.
Mm-hmm.
I see it as a way to extend their value to the building owner and operator, not just to, again, be involved with the upfront that we've discussed for, many times already, and so forth and so on. And I also comment that, if we look back 5, 6, 7 years ago, yes, the hardware was sort of the discussion point. Oh, you want to integrate, use these types of controllers, and so forth and so on. I would say that as our industry has continually progressed, that the hardware itself is now just an enabler, and the true value is in the services, i.e., to your point, cybersecurity, analytics, organizing the data, so forth and so on. The applications that you can apply, such as work order management and so forth and so on. And then one other point is, I think too, is to your point about performance, managing performance and things like that. There's a term that I've used over the years called maximizing lifetime value. So take a piece of equipment. Let's say that on average, it's got a 15-year life cycle, a lifespan. And with the proper maintenance, upgrades, so forth and so on, you can extend that lifetime value another 5, 6, 7 years, or whatever the years may be, which I think the way to do that is through some type of managed service offer.
Cool.
Yeah, well, that was part of, I was trying to argue that, is the reduced maintenance costs over time. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I absolutely see that. Question is, maybe you guys have seen it because I just got back in this recently, but are there any good use cases or case studies where somebody has shown that they've actually accomplished that?
Steve, we had an interesting situation with, when I was with Tridium, we introduced maintenance within the software. It's kind of built into the price and was going to be, is renewable after 18 months or 2 years.
Right.
But when it was introduced, it was done at a summit. Literally everybody in the audience was, just yelling out and screaming, we're never going to do this.
Right.
So there's a mentality issue here within the industry that just said, you can't do this, putting maintenance in, service charges, even though all those good things you were listing were being offered, free software upgrades, all the cybersecurity stuff and everything. There was almost a revolt in the room that, Tridium were going to do that. And I think from a second point of view, when you look at the IT industry and what has happened to people like IBM, where they, most of their stuff was selling on-prem, hardware and software. And now the cloud services thing has come along, and obviously they've had to reinvent themselves. With our own industry, as you quite rightly say, there's a hardware cost up front. And does that mean that could be a potential to move back to the big four type companies again? Because how does a small company, thinking of it from the provider as opposed to the customer, provide all that hardware free of charge up front and amortize it over 5 years, as opposed to a bigger company that could perhaps bankroll it?
Mhm.
And I don't know whether there will be a change there. The smaller companies can't enter that game because they can't finance the thing.
Steve, how would you differentiate the managed services model you're talking about in the building automation industry versus the facility management industry, of which we may be a subset? For instance, companies like Jones Lang LaSalle or CB Richard Ellis and their turnkey managed service offerings they have. Where do we overlap with that? Where don't we?
That's a really good question, and what I'm struggling with right now is to understand how the JLLs, to what degree are the JLLs and the CBREs have the institutional knowledge to do the kinds of services I just described. Now, CBRE bought ESI, so they've got a fairly significant capability. The question is there anybody in the CBRE office here in Richmond, Virginia, as an example, which I've dealt with in the past, who has any knowledge whatsoever that group exists? And if they wanted to pull them in to deliver a service, is there anything in place to make that happen? And I think from the best I know, the answer is no. So it's one thing to buy a company. It's another to modify your business model so that you are actually able to deliver a service. What do you guys, do you have any experience in that regard? Because I'm not seeing where these guys, the JLLs and the CBREs, they talk a game. The question is, are they prepared to deliver? I haven't seen it yet.
I think you're spot on in that they struggle to deliver because it's hard to take the small company they've acquired and clone that expertise over a large network. It's hard.
It's hard.
Yeah. Though I will say the guys at ESI are pretty smart. So Steve, let me ask you this. Having not been around in that game 20 some years ago when IT managed services took over corporate networks, so to speak, I don't know what the friction was for people to give up their passwords and all that stuff and network ownership. Clearly it's happened now. We've normalized on that.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think the friction points are going to be for people to give up their industrial or operational networks? Or are they just going to go, thank you, take them?
I think there's, like Roger was saying earlier, when Tritium came out with the announcement that you got to buy your, it's interesting because I'm dealing with a lot of Tritium partners right now. And I guess the answer, Roger, is 2 years later, they're getting over it. And now they're deciding, you know what, since I got to pay for this bloody thing, I might as well make some money on it. So it's forced them to rethink, how can I take the Tritium content, marry it up with my own labor, and sell it as a complete solution, right? So they're being forced, and the question, I guess, to all of us is, have we reached a point where we can find ways to force or, persuade the industry to change? And I think it takes some risk takers like anything else. But hey, if you don't try, you won't succeed. So I think we're at a point where, particularly with all the damn change going on, now's a good time to consider taking some risks in these areas.
Yeah. Hey,
that's
so
right.
Let me follow up with that real quick, Steve. So that's interesting. You didn't quite answer my question about friction.
Well, let me answer that a little bit further, because like on where you're focused on network, you're definitely going to have friction on the IT department. So they think they know networking. They think they know networking, as you know, the IT way. And so it doesn't almost matter whether the facilities department buys your story or not. The minute they bring IT into it, you've got to sell it all over again. So that's your friction.
All right,
Hey,
go ahead.
sorry, Steve or anyone else on the panel, do you see anyone in our MSI, SI space doing managed services without what you described? Anyone doing it well? Let me put it that way.
I think from what I see so far, the two that immediately come to mind is Brian Turner's company, OTI, and then an ESI, and then Alberio. They're moving strongly in that direction as well. So those are the three that I'm aware of here in the States that are really working hard to be a good managed service provider.
And I think the opportunity is there. It's whether they grab it, because a lot of the MSIs are working closer with the REITs as an ongoing supplier to them, almost like the IT department used to be.
Mhm.
So there really is an opportunity, I think, for the MSIs to actually grab it. It's whether they do. I mean, as Steve said, there's some beginning to do it, but I think, you know, the REITs actually need the MSI, and it's now sort of circumnavigating the traditional contractual role, and that's the opportunity they have to break the mold.
So let me throw this one out. Is this group seeing the OEMs in their branch office business gravitate a little bit to managed services?
Generally speaking, they've struggled just as hard as the FM companies have in scale. In traditional maintenance contracts where they're locked in, we have a terminology called the death spiral, whereby customers see that they're supposed to be getting a service, and these companies have really been in the managed services business for a long time, but a customer will cut their service contract, see no effect in energy performance or other performance, and then wonder why they shouldn't cut it again the next year. And so there's a lot of pressure, as you know, many of these companies haven't been delivering a lot of value through those service contracts. There's a lot of pressure just to keep the existing contracts they have. And,
But I agree, but I would add this, that there are new services, as Steve pointed out, analytics as one, as an example. And again, that performance analytics, not so much the equipment side, but you know, the analytics there, or work order management, or you know, monitoring for COVID, or whatever it is. I mean, there's lots of different services now that that opens up new opportunities for them to add that to, or switch, or provide an option for a managed service offer, as I see it.
I'd love to tie that thought together with Bill's thought, in that if you look at the friction point here, so we've been basically offering managed services analytics for 20 years in this industry, and you know, maybe taught some of those OEMs how to go about doing that business. The problem has always actually been the transition point Bill has talked about. And the transition and the real friction is in procurement. So it's not necessarily the organization of the delivery mechanisms and the channel in our industry. It's the ability of customers to want to procure this stuff. They don't know how. And if we maybe could study how the IT industry crossed that chasm, I think that would be the most interesting thing. Because procurement, you know, managed services by definition are not a commodity. However, if you take it to the limit where JLL and CBRE are cutting the grass and changing the toilet paper, one might argue that that's a commodity. But at the other end of the spectrum, which is IT value added and the kinds of things we really do, it's a professional service. And once again, I'm back on my soapbox saying you cannot low bid professional services or you end up with a debacle. You don't low bid your brain surgeon. You don't low bid your defense counsel. You don't low bid high value added stuff here.
Yeah.
Jim, what's the friction in the procurement process though? Is that purely a sales, sell, pricing issue or value proposition, or
I think it's much worse, Anno. I think structurally they don't know what to do. You know, as we've sold managed services over the years, there was a whole fight to get people to use a consulting contract for our work. That was the first 10 to 15 years. Now people view it as more of a consultancy. We see that, but they still don't know how to fund it. You know, CapEx, OpEx, they don't have budget for it. There's no mechanism in place. They don't know what to do, and there's not a lot of pathways forward. Now, if you look at how JLL and CBRE and when Johnson Controls was in the business, if you looked at how they sold FM, they sold it at the board level. They sold it as a board level of HR reduction, which had nothing to do with the services that were added. And they were done through usually large 2 or 3 party tenders at the C level. Very hard for, you know, those of us who once again are trying to attain escape velocity from the janitorial closet to get up to that C level and make it stick.
Yeah.
Let me jump in real quick and say, when Bill Gates is trying to solve a big problem, he asked 2 questions. Who solved this problem before, and what could we learn from them? So going back to Jim's point about OT managed services a couple decades ago, IT managed services, my next question would be to Roger and Steve and so forth. What's the best channel for this beyond the building automation service level provider? Do you take this to IT managed services and say, hey, do you want to learn what a controller is?
I think some of this always goes back to something that Jim was mentioning about the procurement stage, because I've said it before, but why don't Trane, Carrier, York, and all these guys sell cold water as a utility? Give the chiller away and actually sell cold water when it needs both sides to recognize that that's an opportunity to, because they only get a small amount of their maintenance by putting the chiller in. Someone else will end up servicing it. Whereas it could be a complete deal for both sides where you just provide cold water. If they gave the chiller away in the first place, just like we were talking about giving the BAS hardware away, but there's a guaranteed kind of revenue stream after that because they're going to need the chilled water. And so there's a mentality change needed both sides.
Well, I think you're starting to see the folks like you just mentioned, Roger, add value-added managed services on top of the equipment itself, whether that be guaranteed, connecting into the chillers and without having to go through a BAS, connecting directly, monitoring it, so forth and so on, and then offering that as a service. And I think you're starting to see more of that type of opportunities present itself to people like you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, it has benefits both sides, because the chiller is the most expensive capital item you'll buy in an HVAC thing. So if that goes away from the customer, he doesn't care, about breakdowns and everything else. That's the provider's kind of, got to actually fix it. Plus the fact too, better to sequence the chillers than the manufacturer themselves. So there's opportunities both sides.
Yeah. So Roger, the advantage, it's an interesting point to bring up in the case of the chiller for 2 reasons. One is a York or Carrier can't afford the financing costs, whereas an average contractor is going to struggle in that area, right? So they have to run a lease deal on equipment, and it adds additional costs, whereas these guys can afford that. The second point is you could actually, Carrier could put an SLA around the chill water. How long is it going to be down? How precise is it going to be? All those kinds of things that are parameter driven that they can get where that monthly fee can be adjusted based on performance, because it's very isolated to something they have control over. Because in the IT world, there are SLAs. There is SLAs for how long it takes you to pick up that phone and respond to a call. If you're doing the cloud piece, what's your uptime on the cloud? If you're doing a backup service, how long does it take you to get the backup installed? I mean, there's SLAs. That's very common. And then from a pricing standpoint, I can't remember who was asking that question earlier, but we had to, well, I think it was Jim. Yeah, you were talking about how do you justify in the purchasing department. Well, we had to do an analysis on the how much savings potentially there was in going to a managed service. So we would sit down, if they were serious, they would tell us what their payroll looked like. And we would estimate what portion of that payroll was going away. And then we'd also look at their performance and say, you're going to have better uptime, which means your lost productivity for when your compute's not available is going to be reduced, which means your productivity, we put an estimate as to what the value of that was. So all in all, we had to run this calculation to justify that why they should do a deal with us to sell a managed service. And that's how we got through purchasing, because we had to make the numbers work.
I think that's the thing that I see too, Steve. The biggest challenge we've got is the ROI calculation.
Yeah,
how do you put that in front of them easily, effectively, and quickly and simply for the purchasing department to make those decisions, right? What is the ROI, whether it's operations or people or energy or, you know, whatever the parameters are.
Because for us, the risk of trying to predict how much energy we're going to save, how much we're going to reduce their maintenance costs and mechanical systems, how much labor they're going to save, those are tough ones because they're out of your control. You can't.
That's what I was just going to say. Look, it's when you're eliminating bodies in a commodity IT shop, that's something that you can easily quantify.
Right.
You get to the sophisticated control systems, they're not a commodity anymore at that level. And how do you, it's not only a question of how do you even categorize and make that argument, but how do you make that argument to a group of people that it's way over their head to even understand what you're talking about?
Right.
And this has been the hugest problem with selling analytics. There's absolutely no way to differentiate, because you can take your best and brightest customers out there and they have so little knowledge of what's going on that it's very hard to have a conversation. It's not as cookie cutter as IT. That's one of the problems.
Yeah.
And I think that's the root cause of it, right? Because you can do your demos and you can do your presentations and you can do your case studies, but they're always going to say, well, you know, what does it mean to my building and my system and my application, right? And how do you prove that case out?
So Tracy, would you mind weighing in from what your experience has been in the retail? Because you seem to have been able to successfully sell it.
Yeah, and I've been kind of waiting for a chance to jump in here. It's a little bit different in the retail space, where it has some of the same things in that there's no knowledge of anything that we do. We had to go to sort of these alternate ROI calculations and quantifications. So we weren't replacing people per se, but it was a combination of energy savings and a reduction in maintenance costs, better uptime, risk reduction in terms of temperature monitoring of walk-in, refrigeration freezers, things like that. So it was really a combination of things. And the other thing that we learned is not all buyers are at the same evolution in their understanding of this. So we had to keep our pricing and our contracts really open in terms of, on one end of the scale, it's a pure CapEx. You pay all up front, you own everything. And we're just there to help along the way to, you just start paying a low monthly OpEx fee and we take care of the rest. And then in between that, we chunked off, well, you can pay for installation up front, or you can buy the equipment up front and lower your monthly payments. And, so we had to be really flexible. But I'll tell you, in the past 5 years in the retail industry, since we've really been selling this, the mindsets have started to evolve tremendously in terms of acceptance and understanding that this is the way the world works, right? It's a monthly fee kind of subscription sort of a world. And that's been driven by all of these other industries that have kind of laid the groundwork. And then there's one more piece of the puzzle here that I think has made a huge difference, not necessarily directly in ours yet, but in other industries that we've witnessed and contemplated. And that is the mandate that this is the only way you can buy this, right? I think of like AutoCAD. I had a business associate, a friend who was a reseller of AutoCAD forever. And AutoCAD just declared one year, you can't buy the program anymore. It's only by subscription, much like Microsoft has done and others. And, you know, once that started happening in certain industries, especially in software, we saw acceptance and people adjusted and they learned how to purchase accordingly. And I don't know that anyone in our industry has gone to that where if you want my hardware, my product, or software for that matter, you have to pay a monthly subscription. There's no other option. And it may just take some leader that's gone out there to say, and maybe some of it has started, but that may be needed for our industry to really start to accept this.
How would you possibly get that? Sorry.
Just we have about 3 minutes left. If we can sort of start to wrap this up, and specifically, what can we do to sort of assist this to happen in our industry, maybe? But Jim, you were saying something.
No, I was just going to ask Tracy how one could possibly get through that through the procurement front end, which is a separate budget. I mean, that's even another more complicated thing we have in our industry, is that the procurement end for the construction of buildings is different from the procurement end of the operation of buildings. But I mean, it's a long topic, but I would love to get into it further, Anto, and figure out collectively as a group what we can do to move it forward.
You know, one of the things that we've noticed along that lines is, again, different customers and even different segments. So if we looked at convenience stores versus fast food restaurants, or fine dining versus fast food restaurants, the acceptance and understanding and abilities within that are different. You know, in the QSR world, it is an operations-driven facility, right? It's all about the daily turn and how much revenue that building can produce. That's what the asset in the building is, all about producing revenue day in, day out. And they think along that mentality, you know, from a monthly profit, monthly operational cost. Whereas commercial buildings, you don't have that same level of day-to-day operational thinking in payment. So we found it easier from that standpoint in the retail space than in commercial buildings. Of course, the counter to that is the retail space is, you know, their margins are like that thick. So they don't want to purchase anything extra that doesn't bring in $1, you know, this month. So we really had to hone and fine tune on our value proposition and our quantifying our ROI on that. And there wasn't a silver bullet. It was a collection of things that we had to put together to make that happen.
So Steve, can I ask you to wrap this up? Last word.
Okay. Well, I think what I tried to show today is that IT managed services has been, you know, leading the way, but there's some significant major differences between IT managed services and just being able to duplicate that model in our business. So hopefully I made that really clear. And so I think what I'm hearing across, and I'm not surprised, is we're all struggling. And to, I think it was Tracy, you were saying it'd be great to continue this discussion to say, how do we overcome these challenges? What can we do? Because we all know in our heart of hearts that selling these managed services is good for this industry. It needs it. It's going to benefit from it, right? So what do we need to do differently to get the industry to move off of its traditional, I'm stuck in CapEx mode, that's it. You know, I'll call you when I need you kind of thinking, to one where they're really driving for outcomes
Yep.
all the time. So what do we got to do? So I think that's our challenge.
Good conversation for the future. Focus on the customer, business propositions, focus on positive outcomes. I love it.
Right.
Okay, so I think that's a great place to leave it. We will no doubt continue this in one way or another. So thank you, Steve, for driving this discussion, and thank you, everybody.
Sure.
Thanks for everybody who attended. And this show will be on YouTube by tomorrow morning. Other than that, see you next week. Bye-bye.
Okay. Fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.